Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 12 February 2024. And today I'm going to talk about philosophy of history before St. Augustine. Hayden White argued that all philosophy has a history. In his meta-history, The Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe, he wrote, quote, "A historical account would be any account of the past in which the events that occupied the historical field were properly named, grouped into species and classes of distinctively historical sort, and further related by general conceptions of causation by which changes in their relationships would be accounted for. These operations would presuppose a general conception of historical meaning, an idea or notion of the nature of the historical field and its processes. In short, they would imply a philosophy of history," unquote. So Hayden White is saying that a philosophy of history is implied by a methodology of history. So we could say that Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, Polybius, Tacitus, Livy, Suetonius, Sallust, and other ancient historians all have a philosophy of history in Hayden White's sense. Now consider the complementary claim that all philosophies imply a philosophy of history, even if no philosophy of history is to be found in a given body of work. Philosophical principles could, in theory, be extracted from their context, whatever that context may be, and applied ex post facto to history. We can see that this is almost certain to be true in all cases for analytical philosophy of history. It's not as clear if it applies to substantive philosophy of history. The argument can be made, of course, that philosophical principles can be applied to historical processes, no less than the methods of studying and understanding these processes. But either way, a philosophy of history can be retroactively formulated for past philosophies. In some cases, it's more clear than others. For example, Kant wrote a number of papers on history, but he never wrote a full-scale philosophy of history. He never wrote a critique of historical reason to go along with the critique of pure reason, or the critique of practical reason for that matter. But we can reconstruct a Kantian philosophy of history on the basis of his principles and the basis of his several essays on history. And many scholars have already de facto contributed to this project of a Kantian philosophy of history. There's a significant literature on it. With other philosophers, it's a lot less obvious. And it's much less obvious in particular with ancient philosophers. And in particular, I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle, who more or less created Western philosophy. But they said so little about history. And it's not that they didn't know about history. Thucydides belonged to the same intellectual milieu as Plato and Aristotle. They were all alive at the same time. They were all Athenians. And yet neither Aristotle nor Plato engaged with history in any significant way. Instead, philosophy of history begins with Augustine's City of God, almost 800 years after Plato and Aristotle. But of course, Augustine's thought does not originate in a vacuum. Augustine is commonly called a Christian Platonist, which implies that he owes his philosophical debts primarily to Plato, but really the larger community of Platonists that followed Plato. Giovanni Catapano wrote, quote, "Augustine lived in one of the most homogeneous periods of the history of philosophy. In his time, the philosophical schools which had animated the Hellenistic age with their vivid and bitter debates were virtually reduced to a single one, the Platonic," unquote. But we shouldn't take away from that late antique Platonism was monolithic. When any school of thought becomes pervasive and universal, it is usually internally variegated. So for a historical analogy, consider the Catholic Church during the period immediately before the Reformation. The church is universal and it's accepted all throughout Europe, but it's internally very differentiated. So there are many traditions within the one great tradition, you could say. And the Platonism that Augustine picked up was mostly a mystical Platonism that was filtered through Plotinus and Porphyry and other late antique philosophers who were as interested in attaining a vision of the ultimate as in analyzing philosophical problems. Plato's Timaeus dialogue was one of the few translated in antiquity from Greek into Latin. Cicero actually translated the Timaeus, and because it was translated into Latin, it remains influential throughout the medieval period, when much of Plato had been lost in the West precisely because it was available in Latin. Similarly, a few logical works from Aristotle's Organon had been translated by Boethius in late antiquity, and they also survived in early medieval Europe at a time when most of the Aristotelian corpus was not known. Timaeus was then disproportionately represented compared to the other Socratic dialogues, but it is an exception among Plato's dialogues in that it is concerned with cosmology and, you could say, a big picture conception of the universe, which is going to entail some kind of conception of history. And Timaeus is known, among other things, for its poetic claim that time is the moving image of eternity. Quote from Timaeus: "When the Father who begat the world saw the image which he had made of the eternal gods moving and living, he rejoiced, and in his joy resolved, since the archetype was eternal, to make the creature eternal as far as was possible. Wherefore he made an image of eternity, which is time, having an uniform motion according to number, parted into months and days and years, and also having greater divisions of past, present, and future. These all apply to becoming in time and have no meaning in relation to the eternal nature whichever is and never was or will be, for the unchangeable is never older or younger," unquote. And it goes on in that vein for quite some time. This is tied up with Plato's metaphysics of the forms, wherein the one thing in the world that is truly real are the forms, and the things we see in the world are merely reflections or shadowy mirrorings of them, you could say. It's also, this passage from Timaeus is also tied up with Plato's epistemology, where true knowledge is knowledge of the eternal and the unchanging. Motion and change are objects of opinion, doxa, and not of knowledge. And that is a point that Plato made many times, famously in Book 6 of the Republic, using the motif of the divided line. Aristotle, like Plato, held that true knowledge is knowledge of the eternal and unchanging, but it's less evident in Aristotle. It's clear if you read his Posterior Analytics that science is a deductive exercise, but because Aristotle left quite a number of treatises which could be considered from a contemporary standpoint of natural science, it's less clear that he held this view about knowledge. I found at least one paper on Aristotle's philosophy of history, if we dare call it that, Aristotle's View of History, 1975 by Raymond Weil, and the results are pretty thin. There's not much to go on. There's another paper, Why Aristotle Had No Philosophy of History, 1987 by C. Thomas Powell, in which Powell wrote, quote, "Aristotle could use history as a tool without being disposed to recognize explicitly its philosophical significance. One way of looking at this, of course, is that Aristotle recognizes that what is important in history is not its temporality per se, but the telae that are revealed in historical events as they are in any other arena. So it may be the case that given 1, Aristotle's view of history as historia, 2, his view of time as incidental cause, and 3, a general cultural ambivalence toward chronology in general, there is little reason to expect that Aristotle would take history of any type as a phenomenon worthy of serious discussion, unquote. Powell in this paper also cites D.W. Lucas as saying that for Aristotle, history is not intelligible. And I think that's the most sententious way to formulate Aristotle's view of history. We can't make sense of it, therefore it's not really an object of knowledge. But while Plato wanted to ban poets from his Republic because they made imitations of imitations, that is to say, artists would paint pictures of things and things weren't real. They were mere reflections of the eternal forms. So the artist is a derivation of a derivation. Aristotle, on the contrary, thought that poetry gets us closer to the truth than history. And in one of Aristotle's rare remarks on history from the Poetics, he writes, quote, "The distinction between historian and poet is not in the one writing prose and the other verse. It consists really in that the one describes the thing that has been and the other a kind of thing that might be. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history, since its statements are rather of the nature of universals, whereas those of history are singulars," unquote. Aristotle was not the only philosopher to take a dismissive view of history. Descartes is another famous example of a philosopher who was dismissive of history. And that is an interesting story in itself, and the school of Cartesian historians have followed from that indifference, as it were. Aristotle is also not the only one to argue that history is concerned with the singular. And that idea would come up again in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when a whole school of historical thought grew up around this, primarily starting with Wilhelm Windelband and also developed by Wilhelm Dilthey and Heinrich Rickert, who all argued that, yes, history is concerned with singulars and not with universals, and that means that there needs to be a distinctive kind of science that specifically treats of history, and that it is an ideographic science, whereas the other sciences, the natural sciences, are nomothetic sciences that formulate laws rather than describing particulars and individuals and unique singular events. So there seem to be very few promising avenues of approach for finding even implicit conception of philosophy of history before Augustine. But I think there's one approach that I have not seen represented, and that is a naturalistic philosophy of history. Aristotle represents what I would call proto-naturalism. That is to say, proto-naturalism is naturalism before the scientific revolution gave naturalism the meaning it has today. So there were a lot of implicit naturalistic themes in ancient Greek philosophy, but it's not fully naturalistic in the way we've come to think now. So I'm going to call that proto-naturalism. So Aristotle unquestionably invested some of his time in natural history. His book, The History of Animals, is almost unique in the ancient world, and Aristotle is often regarded, rightly, I think, as the founder of biology because of the history of animals and the parts of animals which he wrote, which were among the first very carefully observed works about natural history and biology. And I would argue that in Aristotle, human beings are nested within Aristotle's natural history. Hence, I call Aristotle's view a proto-naturalism, because human beings then are naturalistic, or to be conceived naturalistically, because they're nested within this larger natural history that is not necessarily all specifically human. And this is an idea that doesn't appear again until the scientific revolution, and it doesn't reach a mature form until the 20th century. In my episode on Karl Löwit, I mentioned that after Löwit criticized the whole tradition of philosophy of history as being derivative of Christian eschatology, Loveth in his later years returned to a kind of naturalism. And the final sentence of his 1960 paper, The Human in History, gives what I would consider a sententious formulation of naturalism. Quote, "We could not exist without the world in which and through which we are all here," unquote. In the same paper, Loveth offers interpretations of Herodotus and Thucydides that are quite interesting in and of themselves, and perhaps I will discuss that another time, but I'm going to pass over that at the moment. So if Aristotle's proto-naturalism places human beings within natural history, he is recognizing, like Loveth said, that we exist in and through the world. But Aristotle, of course, never makes that explicit vis-a-vis history. And an implicit philosophy of history is still quite distinct from a philosophy of history made explicit. And it makes a big difference whether we make our theories explicit or not. Making our theories explicit is an essential part of all rigorous thinking. Sometimes it's a very long and slow process by which we gradually come to explicit consciousness. And philosophy of history itself demonstrates this process. If we count the philosophy of history originating in St. Augustine, and it only really begins to flower, as it were, in the Enlightenment about 1,500 years later, that's a long time of very slow and gradual development. And I would argue that it is linked to a very long, slow development of historical consciousness. That is to say, simply human beings being aware of the temporal and the historical dimensions of the world, which are not at all clear if you are, say, a hunter-gatherer living in the present most of the time. In other cases, the making explicit of a body of knowledge happens in a historically rapid sense, and an area of thought can be transformed quite quickly. So Euclid applied axiomatics to geometry in classical antiquity, but it wasn't until the 19th century that axiomatics was then applied to arithmetic. And the axiomatization of arithmetic, together with the arithmetization of analysis, constituted what we now call the revolution of rigor, which then initiated the foundations of mathematics as an area of research. You could say that this was the come to Jesus moment for mathematics, but history has never had its come to Jesus moment, not yet. We shouldn't be surprised at that, though, because history never received a theoretical exposition in history, in antiquity, I should say. So we know that the Western history begins with Herodotus and Thucydides. So that's an exposition of history, but there was no theoretical exposition of history. That is to say, a theoretical exposition of what Herodotus and Thucydides were doing that was made in classical antiquity until Augustine. And this is why Augustine's City of God is a turning point, because it makes philosophical engagement with history explicit. And it does so in a way that I would argue critically engages with the proto-naturalism that preceded Augustine. One of the controversies that engaged the ancient commentators on Aristotle was the problem of the eternity of the world, by which is meant the historical extension in time of the world. The ancient commentators on Aristotle have been called a missing link in philosophy between 200 and 600 AD, which includes the period of Augustine's life. And one of the great scholarly undertakings of our time has been the translation into English of the massive commentaria in Aristotelum Graeca, which is to say the Greek commentators on Aristotle. So far, there are 118 volumes translated. I think there's about 15,000 total pages of the ancient Greek commentators on Aristotle. So like I said, this is one of the major scholarly undertakings of our time. I have about 20 of these volumes. Here are the volumes from Simplicius on Aristotle's physics, and his commentaries on place and time. So because Aristotle discussed time in several places in his philosophical works, there is the discussion of future contingents on interpretation, and the discussion of time in Aristotle's physics, and especially in Aristotle's On the Heavens, we have the discussion of the eternity of the world. And it has been widely accepted by most that Aristotle argued for the infinite extension of the world in time, although the arguments that Aristotle uses would not be the arguments that we would make today. Almost 100 years after Augustine, John Philoponus, I would argue, completed the transition to a fully Christian and theological conception of cosmology when he published On the Eternity of the World against Proclus, which was published in 529 AD, which was the same year that Justinian I had officially closed the philosophical schools of Athens. And then a few years later, Philoponus wrote On the Eternity of the World against Aristotle. I would argue that Augustine is part of this development of a transition from purely philosophical arguments to more theologically based arguments, and a transition from a pagan conception of the eternity of the world to a Christian conception of the world being finite in time, having a definite beginning and a definite ending in the future. But the thinkers of the period I'm talking about here, Augustine, Boethius, Simplicius, and Philoponus. By the way, I made myself a timeline of late antiquity to help me understand the relationship between these thinkers. I guess that didn't show up very well on the camera, but it's helpful to understand the relationships between them. They all engaged with the philosophical tradition, and primarily they've engaged with Aristotle, but as in the earlier quote I gave, Plato's influence has become almost unquestioned at this point, but that's a little later in the period from in the earlier period, like Alexander of Aphrodisias in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. It's more focused on a commentary on Aristotle. So even though that they were inspired by Christian doctrine to argue for the finitude of the world in time and a definite point of beginning and a definite point of ending, they did give rational philosophical arguments for their position. So to give some of the flavor of that, this is Augustine's City of God, and in Book 11, Chapter 6, title of the chapter, The Beginning of the World and the Beginning of Time Are the Same, he writes, there can be no doubt that the world was not created in time, but with time. An event in time happens after one time and before another, after the past and before the future. But at the time of creation, there could have been no past because there was nothing created to provide the change and movement, which is the condition of time. The world was in fact made with time, if at the time of its creation, change and motion came into existence. This is clearly the situation in the order of the first 6 or 7 days in which morning and evening are named, et cetera, and he goes into discussion of the creation story in Genesis. But that gives you a sense of Augustine's argumentation for the finitude of the world in time. Plato and sympathetic commentators on Plato and the tradition of Christian Platonism to which Augustine belongs represented, I would argue, a distinct alternative to the proto-naturalism that I am attributing to Aristotle. And it was this Christian Platonism that triumphed, at least until the reintroduction of the entirety of the Aristotelian corpus into the West during the High Middle Ages. The ancient debate over whether the universe is finite or infinite in time has continued to be debated in the philosophical tradition. Famously, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Kant tells us that we are not forced to choose between the finitude or the infinitude of the world and time. And his first antinomy of the four antinomies of pure reason that he formulates, he first tries to prove or presents a proof of the world being infinite in space and time, and then he produces a proof of the world being finite in space and time. And for Kant, this is what he calls a paralogism of pure reason. This is what shows how lost we get when we try to prove things that are beyond the scope of the human intellect. Today, the arguments of Kant's formulation of his antinomies can be challenged on Kantorian grounds. That is to say, you can take Kant's argument apart in terms and treat it in terms of set theory. And I believe Bertrand Russell did that in the Principles of Mathematics. I don't have my copy to hand, so I didn't look it up. So there's that on the one hand. On the other hand, relativistic cosmology steps in and says that the universe is finite and unbounded. These arguments and the observations that are purported to support the arguments belong to an ongoing tradition of naturalistic thought, which not always or even often is connected to history and the philosophy of history. But there is, I would argue, a naturalistic philosophy of history that can be derived from this ongoing debate over the eternity of the world or the finitude of the world. Unfortunately, naturalistic conceptions of history run into opposition both from providential philosophers ever since Augustine and from Enlightenment philosophies of history, which Arthur Lovejoy called progressivist philosophies of history. Ever since the Enlightenment and up to the present day, we still live in the intellectual world created for us by the Enlightenment. The touchstone has been progress. And if you don't show that history is making progress, there's obviously something wrong with you. And a naturalistic philosophy of history is, by definition, not providential. If the providential philosophy of history is based on some supernatural power that lies outside naturalism, and is not necessarily progressivist either. So naturalistic theories of history have been attacked on all sides and tend to be misunderstood because they don't fulfill the needs that a providential or a progressivist philosophy of history does fulfill and makes them cognitively satisfying, you could say. Another problem with what I'm talking about here, and starting out with mentioning Plato's account of time and Aristotle's account of time, is what I call a philosophical disconnect. First, an example. There is a philosophical disconnect between political philosophy and philosophy of law. You would think that political philosophy and legal philosophy would be very closely intertwined, and that law would be the implementation of the theories put forth in a political philosophy. And so they'd be closely bound up in each other. But in fact, that's not the way it is. Philosophy of law is pursued virtually in isolation from political philosophy, and vice versa. You have to read each in isolation because they have their own arguments, their own classics of the discipline, their own central ideas and thematic motivations, and they aren't the same. I would suggest that we need to bring a disconnect like that together if we're going to make sense of things. And even more so, I would suggest that one of the most profound disconnects in the whole of philosophy is the disconnect between the philosophy of time and the philosophy of history. Again, you'd think that a philosophy of history would be intimately bound up with a philosophy of time, because history itself is a function of time. And yet the philosophy of history is pursued in virtual isolation from the philosophy of history, and vice versa. Again, I think this disconnect needs to be brought together. I think a naturalistic philosophy of history can bring them together, and that's why I mention Plato and Aristotle on time as being implicitly involving a philosophy of history which could be derived from them if the effort was made. To my knowledge, the effort hasn't been made, but it remains a potentially fertile field of research. I mentioned in a previous episode that St. Augustine is one of the great exceptions among philosophers because he formulated both a philosophy of time in, I think, the 11th book of the Confessions, and a philosophy of history, which is in the City of God. So, since they're in the head of the same man, you could say there's got to be a significant degree of interaction between them, and there is a large literature on time and eternity in Saint Augustine, because he presents interesting ideas, but there's also a number of unresolved problems that have been extensively studied in the literature. But I have not seen this brought together in a philosophy of history, or even in a context that takes history into account, much less bringing it together in the context of the philosophy of history we find in the City of God. That makes Augustine a unique point of, or we already knew Augustine was the origin of philosophy of history in the Western tradition. He's also unique because he does have both a philosophy of time and a philosophy of history that are connected, but could be brought into closer connection. So we still have much to learn from Augustine. So thanks for listening, and take it easy.